The smell comes first. Smoke, thick and black, curling low over water the color of rust. Somewhere behind it, a bell is ringing. No one answers it. A woman kneels in the mud of a riverbank, her hands buried in the wreckage of a wooden shrine, searching for something that is no longer there. Her lips move without sound. Ash falls on her shoulders like gray snow, settling into her hair, into the folds of her torn silk, into the corners of her eyes, above her, where 1,000 golden spires once caught the sun and hurled it back across the Chao Phraya River in blinding sheets of light. There is only smoke. Towers that took 100 years to build are collapsing in minutes. Somewhere in that fire lies a throne. Somewhere in that fire lies a crown. And somewhere in that fire, though no one will find him for days, lies a king. This is Ayutthaya, once one of the wealthiest cities on earth. A city so vast that European merchants compared it to Paris. So rich that its harbor held ships from Lisbon, from Amsterdam, from Isfahan, from Nagasaki, all waiting for a share of its silk and rice and lacquerware. This is the seat of 33 kings, 400 years of dynasty, a kingdom that called itself invincible, and on this night, it is being erased. But the fire did not begin with the enemy at the gates. It began years earlier, inside the palace walls, in whispered conversations between brothers who wanted the same throne. It began with poison in a cup and a rope around a prince's neck, and a court so consumed by its own hunger for the crown that it forgot to watch the horizon. The kingdom did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was busy destroying itself. To understand how a city like this could burn, you must first understand what it was before the fire. Ayutthaya sat on an island formed by 3 rivers, a natural fortress ringed by water, its canals threading through the city like veins beneath skin. The Siamese called it the Venice of the East, though the merchants who wrote that phrase in their letters home had likely never smelled Ayutthaya at dawn, the incense from 1,000 temples, mixing with the stench of fish markets, the sweet rot of tropical fruit, the smoke of cooking fires rising from houses built on stilts above the brown water. By the early 18th century, this was a city of nearly 1 million people, larger than London, larger than Paris. Golden chetas pierced the sky in every direction, their spires catching the light so that travelers arriving by river said the city seemed to be on fire. Even in peacetime, a cruel irony. Given what was coming, the wealth here was staggering. Foreign traders came for rice, for teak, for tin, for the deerskins that Japanese samurai prized for their armor. They left with holds full of silver and stories they could not make their countrymen believe. Of a king so revered, his subjects were forbidden to look upon his face. Of white elephants kept in golden stables and worshipped as divine. Of a court so layered in ritual that a single audience with the monarch required weeks of preparation. Beneath the gold, though something else was growing. Poverty pressed against the walls of the wealthy quarters. Corvée labor bound ordinary men to unpaid service for months out of every year, building temples they would never worship in, digging canals they would never sail. The gap between the palace and the paddy field was not a gap. It was a chasm, and inside the palace itself, a different kind of poverty was spreading, a poverty of trust. Siamese succession had no fixed law. There was no eldest son guaranteed the throne, no clear line of inheritance written into unbreakable custom. A king could name any son, any brother, any favored relative as heir, and that naming could be reversed with his next breath. This ambiguity, meant perhaps to keep power flexible, had instead planted a seed of violence in every reign. Brothers eyed brothers. Uncles eyed nephews. Every prince who wore silk in that palace understood, from childhood, that his own kin might be the one to end his life. This was the machine the fire would later exploit. Not a foreign army first. A family. And the family at the center of Ayutthaya's final century would prove that no wall, however high, can protect a kingdom from the people who rule behind it. His name was Burmah. And when he took the throne in 1733, he did so by wading through the blood of his own relatives. The years before his reign had been a slaughterhouse of succession. His predecessor, King Taisei, had left behind sons and half-brothers, all convinced the crown belonged to them. And Ayutthaya's canals had briefly run red with the bodies of executed princes as one faction annihilated another. Burmah emerged from that carnage, not because he was the most beloved, but because he was the most ruthless survivor left standing. He understood, perhaps better than any king before him, that the throne was not simply inherited. It was defended, moment to moment, against the very people closest to it. For nearly 3 decades, Burmah's reign would be remembered, at least on the surface, as a golden age. Temples rose. Buddhist scholarship flourished, drawing monks from as far as Ceylon to study under Siamese masters. Trade swelled the treasury. Poets composed verses that would be memorized for centuries. To a foreign visitor arriving by ship, Ayutthaya in these years looked eternal, its spires gleaming, its markets loud with commerce, its king seated on a throne that seemed as permanent as the river itself. But permanence is a lie kings tell themselves, behind the temple walls, behind the smiling audiences and the ceremonial elephants. Burmah was aging, and every day he aged. The question that haunts every Siamese court grew louder in the corridors. Who comes next? He had many sons. That was the problem. Among them, 2 names would come to matter more than all the others: Prince Ekkathat and Prince Uthumphon. Uthumphon was the younger, but he was intelligent, disciplined, favored by scholars and by his father for his temperament. Ekkathat was older and by most surviving accounts volatile, resentful, consumed by a hunger for the throne that seemed to grow sharper the more he suspected it would be denied him. Burmah watched his sons circle each other for years, the way a man might watch 2 dogs he has raised from puppies begin, slowly, to bare their teeth. And in the final years of his life, he made a choice that would decide the fate of his kingdom. Though he could not have known it at the time, he named Uthumphon his heir. He passed over his eldest son for the crown. Then everything changed. Ekkathat did not accept the decision quietly. He began building alliances of his own within the court, cultivating loyalty among nobles who feared what a reign under the disciplined, reform-minded Uthumphon might cost them, the corrupt officials who profited from the old system, the courtiers who preferred a weak king they could manipulate over a strong one who might clean house. Ekkathat offered them exactly what they wanted, a ruler they could control. In 1758, Burmah died. For a brief, fragile moment, Uthumphon held the throne exactly as his father had intended. He entered the monastery of his ancestors, took his vows, sat as king in name and ceremony. But a crown resting on unsteady ground does not stay balanced for long. Ekkathat moved. Within weeks, through a mixture of court pressure, intimidation, and the quiet withdrawal of noble support that left Uthumphon isolated inside his own palace, the younger brother was forced to abdicate. Ekkathat took the throne he had wanted since he was old enough to understand what a throne meant. Uthumphon, the king his father had chosen, the king the kingdom needed, entered a monastery not as a symbol of piety, but as an act of survival. He shaved his head. He put on the saffron robes of a monk. It was the only door left that did not end in execution. Consider what that moment must have felt like from inside the palace walls. A king anointed by his father, blessed by Brahmin priests, seated on a throne considered divine by every subject who bowed before him, abandoning all of it within weeks. Not because he lacked the right to rule, but because the men around him had already decided who would be permitted to survive. Power in Ayutthaya was never simply given. It was taken, and it was taken by whoever proved most willing to spill blood or threaten to spill it, before hesitation could cost them everything. Ekkathat did not stop at forcing his brother into robes. Chroniclers describe a purge that followed, a quiet culling of officials and relatives whose loyalty to Uthumphon made them liabilities to the new regime. Some were exiled. Some simply disappeared from the records entirely, their names surviving only in the gaps between other men's stories. This was how a king secured a throne he had not been chosen for, not through the confidence of a kingdom, but through the silence of everyone too frightened to object. Ayutthaya now had its king, and the kingdom's slow death had already begun. Though almost no one in that gilded palace understood it yet, the man now wearing the crown was not prepared for what was coming. And the empire he ruled was about to discover, in the cruelest way imaginable, exactly what that meant. To understand why one weak king could bring down 400 years of dynasty, you have to understand the machine beneath the throne, the systems of power, religion, and military obligation that had, for centuries, kept Ayutthaya standing even through mediocre rulers. At the center of everything sat the concept of the devaraja, the god-king. Siamese kingship was not merely political. It was cosmological. The king stood at the apex of a universe modeled on Hindu-Buddhist cosmology, a living axis between heaven and earth. Subjects prostrated themselves in his presence. They were forbidden to raise their heads above the level of his feet. Language itself bent around him. An entire vocabulary of royal words existed, spoken only in reference to the monarch, so that even grammar reinforced the unbridgeable distance between king and commoner. This sacred aura was, in ordinary times, a source of extraordinary stability. It meant that even a mediocre king commanded obedience simply by existing, by being anointed, by sitting upon a throne blessed by Brahmin priests and Buddhist monks in rituals stretching back centuries. Rebellion against the god-king was not simply treason. It was a kind of blasphemy, but sacred authority is a strange kind of power. It can command obedience without commanding competence. It can fill a throne room with bowed heads while the man on the throne makes catastrophic decisions. Because no one dares question a god, beneath the king stood the Sekdina system, a vast hierarchy that assigned every person in the kingdom, from the highest minister to the lowest farmer, a numerical rank determining how much land, labor, and legal standing they possessed. It bound peasants to patrons, patrons to nobles, nobles to princes, princes to the crown, in an unbroken chain of obligation. Every man owed labor to someone above him. Every man commanded labor from someone below. This system built Ayutthaya's temples. It dug Ayutthaya's canals. And in wartime, it filled Ayutthaya's armies, because every patron was required to deliver his bound men to the king's service. Armed and ready whenever the drums called for war. It was, in theory, an elegant machine. In practice, it was only as strong as the men operating its levers, and by the reign of Ekkathat, those levers were in the hands of men who had learned that loyalty to a weak king was more profitable than service to a strong one. Corruption crept through the officer, cores like rot through wet timber. Military commissions were bought rather than earned. Records from the period, later compiled by Burmese and European observers alike, describe a defense apparatus hollowed out from within, garrisons undermanned, fortifications neglected, the great cannons that had once guarded the river approaches to the capital, left to rust in their emplacements while the funds, meant for their maintenance, vanished into the pockets of officials who answered to no one, because the king who should have held them accountable was too consumed by court politics to look outward. Religion, too, played its double role. Buddhist merit-making, the accumulation of spiritual credit through temple donations and religious observance, had become, under Ekkathat, less a discipline and more an obsession, an anxious, compulsive piety that consumed royal attention and treasury alike, as if enough golden Buddha images might somehow purchase the stability that competent governance had failed to provide. Meanwhile, beyond the western mountains, in the kingdom of Burma, a different kind of machine was being built. Not a machine of ritual and rank, but a machine of conquest, disciplined, battle-hardened, led by a dynasty that had just finished unifying its own fractured territory through relentless, efficient violence. Ayutthaya's machine ran on sacred obligation and internal hierarchy. Burma's machine ran on war, and war, unlike ritual, does not care how many heads bow before a throne. There was one more piece of the machine worth understanding, because it explains why so few voices inside the palace dared warn the king of what was coming. Siamese court etiquette had over centuries evolved an elaborate architecture of flattery. Officials who brought bad news to a sacred monarch risked being associated with that news, tainted by it, sometimes punished for it, as though the messenger had somehow authored the disaster he was reporting. The result was a slow, systemic silence, a court where accurate information about troop shortages, empty granaries, and undermanned garrisons traveled upward only in softened, diluted form. If it traveled at all, a king who cannot be told the truth is not protected by his power. He is blinded by it. This is the paradox at the center of every sacred monarchy that has ever collapsed from within. The very rituals designed to project strength, the prostration, the elevated language, the untouchable distance between ruler and ruled, become, in a crisis, a wall between the throne and reality itself. Ekkathat sat at the center of an empire humming with warning signs, and heard almost none of them, because the machine built to glorify him had also, without anyone intending it, been built to deceive him. The man who would burn Ayutthaya to the ground was named Ayutthaya, and before he ever aimed a cannon at Siam, he had already rebuilt an empire from ashes. Burma, in the 1730s, had fractured into warring principalities. Its old dynasty collapsed, its territory carved apart by Mon rebels who had sacked the Burmese capital itself. Ayutthaya rose from the position of a minor village headman to unify the shattered kingdom through a campaign so relentless that within a decade he had not only restored Burmese sovereignty but turned his armies outward. Hungry for expansion, he looked east toward Siam, and he saw a kingdom he believed was ripe. The first Burmese invasion came in 1759, when Ayutthaya himself led his forces across the border, driving toward the very walls of Ayutthaya. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed the capital might fall then, a full generation before its actual destruction. Ekkathat's court, caught almost entirely by surprise, scrambled to organize a defense while the god king who was supposed to embody Siam's invincibility proved unable to command even his own generals with any coherence. It was Uthumphon, the deposed king, the monk in saffron robes who was pulled from the monastery in that crisis and asked to help direct the defense, because everyone in that desperate court understood, even if none dared say it aloud, that the wrong brother sat on the throne. The siege was broken, in the end, not by Siamese strength but by chance and monsoon. Ayutthaya was wounded, either by an exploding cannon or by illness. Accounts differ, and he died soon after during the retreat. His army withdrew. Ayutthaya breathed again, but it was a borrowed breath, and the kingdom mistook survival for strength. In the years that followed, Ekkathat's court settled back into the old patterns. Uthumphon returned to his monastery. His brief, brilliant competence discarded the moment the immediate crisis passed. Corruption resumed its slow erosion of the military. Court intrigue resumed its poisonous circling. The lesson of 1759, that the kingdom's defenses were dangerously hollow, was learned by exactly no one who had the power to fix it. Ayutthaya's son, Shinbushin, inherited both his father's throne and his father's unfinished ambition. Where Ayutthaya had been a conqueror by necessity, forging an empire from chaos, Shinbushin was a conqueror by appetite. A king who understood that his father's failure at Ayutthaya's walls was not a defeat to mourn, but an invitation. To finish the job, he began preparing almost immediately. Not a single desperate campaign, but a methodical, multi-year strategy, two armies moving from different directions, converging on the Siamese capital in a pincer that would leave no escape route and no possibility of the kind of last-minute rescue that had saved the city before. In 1765, the drums began again. Two Burmese columns crossed into Siamese territory almost simultaneously. One from the north, one from the south, both converging with terrible patience toward the island city at the confluence of three rivers. Siamese border garrisons, undermanned and poorly supplied, fell one after another, sometimes with barely a fight, their commanders either fleeing or discovering too late that the funds meant for their defenses had never actually reached them. By early 1766, the two Burmese armies had linked up and surrounded Ayutthaya itself. Inside those walls, the court that had spent decades consumed by its own internal wars now had to face an enemy that had spent decades consuming everyone else's. The siege that followed would last more than a year, and it would prove in the most brutal way imaginable that a kingdom's rock does not announce itself gradually. It waits. And then, all at once, it collapses. The siege of Ayutthaya, beginning in earnest in 1766, was not a single battle. It was a slow strangulation, a year-long tightening of the noose around a city that had never in 400 years imagined it could be conquered. Burmese forces ringed the capital on all sides, cutting supply lines, burning outlying villages, forcing the rural population to flee into the already overcrowded city or into the forest to starve. Inside the walls, food grew scarce. Rice prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. Disease, the silent companion of every siege in human history, moved through the crowded streets and canals, filling the temples not with worshippers, but with the sick and the dying. And still, the court fought itself as much as it fought the enemy outside. Ekkathat, according to multiple accounts left by contemporaries and later chroniclers, proved catastrophically unsuited to wartime leadership. He second-guessed his generals. He hoarded authority he did not know how to use, refusing to delegate command in ways that might have allowed more capable officers to organize an effective defense. Court factions continued their old rivalries even as Burmese cannon fire echoed across the rooftops. Nobles maneuvering for advantage in a kingdom that might not exist by the time their maneuvering paid off. There were moments of genuine heroism. Siamese defenders held sections of the wall against repeated assault with a tenacity that surprised even the Burmese commanders. Fire ships were launched down the river in an attempt to destroy the Burmese fleet. Sorties slipped out under cover of darkness to burn enemy siege works. For a time, it even seemed the defenders might simply outlast the invaders. As the rainy season arrived and flooded the surrounding plains, historically Ayutthaya's greatest natural defense, the annual flood that had saved the city from siege after siege for centuries. But Shinbushin had learned from his father's failure, where previous Burmese campaigns had withdrawn when the floods came. This time the army built elevated platforms, stockpiled supplies, and simply waited out the water rather than retreating from it. The kingdom's oldest ally, its own geography, had finally been outmaneuvered. Inside the walls, the hidden cost of decades of court paranoia and corruption revealed itself in full. Granaries that should have held years of reserves had been depleted by mismanagement long before the siege began. Officers who should have commanded loyal, disciplined troops instead commanded men who had not been paid in months, whose equipment had been sold off by corrupt quartermasters, whose morale collapsed as starvation set in around them. Reports from the period describe scenes almost too grim to narrate without pause. Mothers offering their own bodies for a handful of rice to feed their children. The wealthy hoarding stores behind locked doors while their neighbors starved in the street. Temple bells that once called the faithful to prayer, now ringing to warn of yet another collapsed section of wall. Ekkathat, watching his kingdom disintegrate around him, retreated further into isolation. Surrounded by advisors who told him what he wished to hear rather than what he needed to know. This is the particular cruelty of absolute power built on sacred distance, a king so insulated by ritual, by the prohibition against ordinary men even meeting his gaze, that by the time the truth reached him, it had already been softened, filtered, and delayed past the point of use that the god-king could not see the ground beneath his own throne. There is a particular sound described by several chroniclers of the siege's final months, one that recurs enough across different accounts to feel like more than embellishment, the sound of temple bells, ringing not in celebration but in warning. Over and over, through nights lit orange by fires the defenders could no longer extinguish. Survivors would later say they stopped counting how many times that sound woke them, because by the final weeks, it never truly stopped. Negotiations were attempted. Twice, Siamese envoys were sent to the Burmese camp seeking terms, seeking any arrangement that might spare the city from total destruction. Both times, they returned with nothing, because Shinbushin had not marched two armies across hundreds of miles of jungle and floodplain to accept a negotiated peace. He had come to erase a rival dynasty from the map, and a starving, fractured court had nothing left to offer him that might change his mind. By March of 1767, conditions inside the walls had passed beyond desperation into something closer to collapse. Soldiers deserted their posts not out of cowardice, but because there was nothing left to defend with, no dry powder, no working cannon, no officers left who had not already fled or fallen. The chain of obligation that had once bound every peasant to a patron, every patron to a noble, every noble to the crown, had finally, after 14 months of siege, simply snapped. And in April of 1767, after 14 months of siege, the Burmese finally breached the walls. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The fall of Ayutthaya, when it came, took less than a day. Though it ended 4 centuries, Burmese forces poured through breaches in the ancient walls under cover of darkness and fire, their engineers having finally succeeded in undermining sections of the fortifications that decades of neglect had left structurally compromised. What resistance remained inside the city collapsed within hours, the exhausted, starving defenders unable to mount any organized counterattack against an enemy that had spent 14 months perfecting every angle of assault. Shinbushin's orders, according to most historical accounts, were deliberate and severe. This was not simply a conquest meant to install a puppet ruler or extract tribute. This was meant to be an annihilation, a demonstration so total that Siam would not soon recover the capacity to threaten Burma again. The city burned for days, temples that had stood for centuries, their golden spires visible for miles down the river, collapsed into rubble and ash. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts, historical chronicles, religious texts accumulated over 400 years of scholarship, were consumed in the flames. An act of cultural erasure so complete that Siamese historians would spend the following century trying to reconstruct their own kingdom's history from fragments, from foreign accounts, from the fractured memory of survivors. Statues of the Buddha, some cast in solid gold, were stripped, melted, or smashed apart by soldiers searching for treasure beneath their sacred surfaces. The royal palace, the seat of 33 kings, was looted and burned. Residents who had not fled or died of starvation during the siege were killed, enslaved, or driven from the ruins in a mass deportation that would carry tens of thousands of Siamese captives back across the border into Burmese territory. A forced exodus of artisans, scholars, and nobility whose skills would enrich a foreign court instead of their own. And somewhere in that chaos, King Ekkathat vanished. The historical record here grows deliberately, hauntingly uncertain. Some accounts claim he fled the burning palace and died of starvation within days, hiding in the forest outside the city he had failed to protect. A god-king reduced to foraging like the poorest of his former subjects. Other accounts suggest he was killed during the initial assault, his body never formally identified amid the thousands of corpses left in the ruins. Siamese chronicles, compiled decades later by a dynasty that had every reason to distance itself from his failures, offer versions that shift and contradict, as if even history itself could not decide how much dignity to grant him in death. No tomb marks his passing. No monument records his final words, if he spoke any. The man who forced his brother out of the monastery to seize a throne he was not equipped to hold ended his life as anonymously as any peasant caught in the fire he could not prevent. His brother, Uthumphon, the king their father had actually chosen, the king who might have organized a defense worthy of the name, was captured by the Burmese and carried away into captivity, living out his remaining years far from the kingdom he had briefly, properly ruled, a footnote to a catastrophe he had spent his entire adult life trying to prevent. The empire survived. In fragments, in refugees, in memory. The kings who had fought over it did not. What was left, when the smoke finally cleared over the ruins of Ayutthaya, was almost nothing. A shattered island of blackened stone and headless Buddha statues, roots slowly reclaiming what fire had not consumed. The city that foreign merchants had once compared to Paris, that had commanded trade routes stretching from Japan to Persia, was simply gone. Abandoned so completely that within a generation the jungle had begun swallowing its ruins whole. But a kingdom is not only its capital. Within months of the fall, a Siamese general named Thaksin, who had broken out of the doomed city before its final collapse, began gathering the scattered remnants of Siamese resistance, eventually reunifying the fractured territory and founding a new capital at Thonburi, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become modern Bangkok. Siam, as a nation, survived its darkest hour, but Ayutthaya, the city, the dynasty, the 400-year experiment in sacred kingship that had built golden spires and bound an entire society into a hierarchy of unbreakable obligation, did not survive. It ended not primarily because a foreign army was strong, though it was, but because the men entrusted with its defense had spent the years before the siege consumed by a war against each other. A war for a throne that would ultimately give the winner nothing but ash. There's a particular kind of ruin that visitors to the archaeological site at Ayutthaya still encounter today. Centuries later, a stone Buddha head, severed from its body sometime during the sack of the city. Its features weathered by rain and time, somehow ensnared within the roots of a growing banyan tree. The wood having grown slowly around the stone over the following decades until face and root became inseparable. No one placed it there deliberately. Nature simply did what nature does to abandoned things, wrapping itself around a fallen god until the two became a single image, reproduced now in countless photographs, gazing out at tourists with an expression that seems, depending on the light, either peaceful or accusing. It is worth asking what that image means, beyond its beauty. A god-king's face, cut loose from the body that gave it power, held now not by a throne or an army, but by a tree that does not know or care what it has captured. Perhaps that is the truest monument this story deserves. Every kingdom that has ever called itself eternal has, somewhere in its final chapter, a room where brothers plotted against brothers instead of watching the horizon. Ayutthaya's walls did not fail because they were built poorly. They failed because the men behind them had spent a generation aiming their weapons at each other. And by the time they finally turned to face the true enemy, there was no strength left to stop it. The fire that consumed Ayutthaya did not begin at its gates. It began on a throne, in a whispered conversation between two brothers who wanted the same crown, and it burned quietly, unseen, for years before anyone outside the palace walls ever smelled the smoke. Somewhere, even now, another throne is being fought over in exactly the same silence. Asterisk.